The world of the North Atlantic in the late 10th century was a thin, precarious ribbon of human existence stretched across a vast and indifferent sea. On the westernmost edge of that ribbon, on the brutal coast of Greenland, a society clung to life in a landscape of rock and ice, a settlement founded by the fiery outlaw Eric the Red. It was here, in this hard place, that the stories of a richer, greener land further west began to coalesce from rumor into tangible ambition. The sagas, those intricate tapestries of oral history later woven into vellum, tell us of a man named Bjarni Herjolfsson, blown off course on a voyage from Iceland, who glimpsed strange wooded shores but refused to land, his mind fixed only on reaching his father in Greenland. His report, however, became a seed planted in fertile ground. It fell to a man of different temperament to water it, Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, a figure poised between his father's ruthless drive and a newer, more calculating ambition. Around the year 1000 AD, Leif purchased Bjarni's ship, gathered a crew of 35 men, and set out not to chase a rumor, but to claim a discovery. His voyage was a masterpiece of Norse wayfinding, a journey across the treacherous Denmark Strait and down the unknown coastline of a continent. They first made landfall on a desolate shore of flat stone, naming it Helluland, the land of the flat stones, likely the barren coasts of Baffin Island. Sailing south, they found a land of dense forests and white sandy beaches, which they called Markland, the land of forests, perhaps the Labrador coast. Pushing further, driven by that quintessential Norse hunger for better pasture, for richer resources, they finally found their prize. They came to a place where a gentle bay led to a grassy headland, where salmon choked the river and the grass stayed green through the winter, where the climate was mild enough that they felt no need to stall cattle over the coldest months. Here, Leif Erikson and his crew built their booths temporary seasonal shelters, and named this place Vinland for the wild grapes or berries they found growing. It was a moment of profound achievement, the first documented European foothold on the North American continent, a beachhead established not by empires or monarchs, but by the crew of a single Nar. They overwintered in relative comfort, their storehouses full, their spirits high, before sailing back to Greenland with a cargo of timber and grapevines, treasures in a timber-starved land. Leif's return was triumphant. He was now Leif the Lucky, his fortune and legend secure. His success inevitably bred emulation. The Greenland settlement, perpetually on the edge of sustainability, saw in Vinland a promise of expansion, of wealth, of a future less grim. The next chapter, however, would not be written by a lucky explorer, but by his family, and it would transform the promise of a new world into a complex and ultimately shattering American nightmare. The saga turns now to Thorvald Eriksson, Leif's younger brother, a man whose story would begin to stain the green dream of Vinland with a darker hue. Emboldened by his brother's account and driven by the same familial ambition, Thorvald took Leif's ship and crew back to the base at Leifsbother, intent on a fuller exploration. For 2 years they used the camp as a base, exploring the coastlines and fjords of this new land. Their existence was one of seasonal routine and cautious reconnaissance, until, during one such exploration along a wooded shore, they encountered the people who already called this land home. The Norse called them Skrælingr, a term loaded with contempt and otherness, likely meaning wretches or shriveled ones. They were, almost certainly, the ancestors of the Bearthuk or the Dorset and Thule peoples. The initial contact was a disaster of violent misunderstanding. Seeing 3 hide-covered canoes upturned on the beach with 3 men sleeping underneath, Thorvald and his men did what Viking raiders had done for centuries along the coasts of Europe. They attacked. They captured and killed 8 of the 9 men they found, with only 1 escaping in a canoe. It was a preemptive strike born of a mindset forged in the fjords and islands of the North Atlantic, where any unknown people were a potential threat to be neutralized. In that moment, Thorvald transplanted the brutal, transactional violence of the European raid onto the shores of the New World. The consequence was immediate and inescapable. The survivor raised an alarm, and soon a flotilla of skin boats swarmed from the interior of the fjord, and a hail of arrows arced towards the Norsemen. The Norse, shielded by their own superior weapons and their ship's bulwark, held their ground, but the dynamic was forever altered. They were no longer unseen explorers, they were invaders who had drawn first blood. In the ensuing retreat, as the saga tells it, an arrow found its mark. Thorvald Eriksson, son of Eric the Red, brother to Leif the Lucky, was mortally wounded. His dying words, as recorded, are etched with a bitter, tragic irony. Pulling the arrow from his wound, he mused, "This is a rich country we have found. There is plenty of fat around my entrails." He then instructed his men to bury him on the headland he had found so promising, to place crosses at his head and feet, and to call the place Crossarns, Cross Cape. It was a poignant, lonely end, far from the saga hero's pyre in a Norse fjord. Thorvald's death was the first violent price paid for the Vinland venture, a stark signal that this land, for all its bounty, was not empty, and its people would not be passive. The legacy he left was not a thriving settlement, but a gravesite and a deepening enmity. The dream was still alive, but it now had a cemetery, and the next expedition would be led by a man for whom violence was not a tactical choice, but a fundamental aspect of his being, Thorfinn Karlsefni, a wealthy Icelandic trader who would attempt the first, true, large-scale colonization of Vinland, bringing with him his wife, the formidable Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir, and a company that included another of Eric the Red's children, a woman whose name would become synonymous with the fury and failure of the enterprise, Freydís Eriksdóttir. Thorfinn Karlsefni's expedition represented the peak of Norse ambition in Vinland, a deliberate and well-provisioned attempt to establish not just a seasonal camp, but a permanent, self-sustaining colony. He arrived at Lisbúðir with a fleet that carried over 60 men and 5 women, along with a herd of livestock, the clear intention to farm, to trade, and to put down roots. For a time, the settlement prospered. They built houses more substantial than the initial booths, they explored the region, and in their first year, they made peaceful contact with the indigenous people. The sagas describe this initial meeting with a sense of wary curiosity. The Skrælings arrived in their skin boats, staring in astonishment at the Norse settlement, and trading commenced. The Norse offered milk and dairy products, which the natives bartered for furs and grey pelts. It was a fragile, nascent economy of mutual benefit, a thread of possibility. Yet, this thread was frayed by the same cultural chasm that had doomed Thorvald. The Norse worldview, shaped by a hierarchy of strength and a concept of property alien to many hunter-gatherer societies, could not comprehend the subtleties of this new relationship. When a bull belonging to the Norse herd bellowed and charged, the startled Skrælings fled in terror, returning 3 weeks later not to trade, but to fight. They came with a force, and the battle that followed was a clash of technological asymmetries. The Norse, with their iron weapons, mail shirts, and disciplined shield wall, were a formidable fighting machine on open ground. The Skrælings, however, employed weapons and tactics perfectly suited to their environment. They used a strange device the sagas call a valslöngva, a slinging engine, likely a staff sling or a catapult, to hurl a large, dark sphere that made a terrifying noise when it landed. Perhaps a bladder filled with gravel or a weight wrapped in hide. More effectively, they exploited the terrain and their mobility, attacking from the flanks and retreating quickly. Though Karlsefni's men held the field, the message was clear. Coexistence on Norse terms would be a state of perpetual war. The colony's morale, facing an enemy that could appear and disappear into the landscape at will, began to fracture. The promise of Vinland was now shadowed by constant vigilance and fear. After 3 hard years, the decision was made to abandon the settlement. The great experiment in transatlantic colonization had failed, not for lack of resources or will, but because the social and environmental costs had grown too high. The Greenlanders returned home with their timber and their furs, and with stories that would gradually harden from tales of opportunity into legends of a dangerous, inaccessible place. Yet, one final, brutal coda remained to be written, an episode that would strip the venture of any lingering heroic gloss and reveal the darkest capacities of those who had journeyed to the new world. This story belongs not to a chieftain or a trader, but to a woman of singular and terrifying resolve, Freydís Eriksdóttir. Freydís was a daughter of Eric the Red, sister to Leif and the slain Thorvald, a woman who inherited her family's ambition and temper in its most unbridled form. Sometime after Karlsefni's return, a partnership was formed between 2 Icelandic brothers, Helgi and Finnbogi, and Freydís, who used her familial claim to Leifsbúðir as her stake. They agreed to sail to Vinland in 2 ships, share all profits equally, and keep their crews at parity. From the outset, Freydís violated this pact. Upon reaching the settlement, She insisted the Icelanders move their belongings out of the houses Leif had built, claiming her brother's privilege for herself and her crew. The tension was palpable, a cold war in a confined space. The two parties kept to themselves, exploring and trading separately, but the shared base camp was a crucible of resentment. Winter descended, and with it, the inevitable breakdown. According to the Saga of the Greenlanders, Freydis, seething with a sense of entitlement and grievance, staged a monstrous deception. She went to the brothers' camp in the dead of night, claiming she wished to speak to Finnbogi. She told him she wanted to buy their larger ship, as she was unhappy with her own, and when he refused, she feigned distress, claiming she had been mistreated and beaten by her own husband. She then returned to her own lodge and woke her husband, Thorvard, with frost on her clothes and lied to him as well, claiming the Icelanders had assaulted her. She prodded his shame and goaded him to action, questioning his manhood until he and his men were roused to a fury. They seized the sleeping Icelanders, bound them, and dragged them outside. Then, one by one, as each Icelander was brought out, Freydis demanded his death. When none of the men would kill the 5 women in the Icelanders' party, Freydis herself took up an axe. The saga recounts the scene with chilling starkness. She killed all 5 women herself, leaving them dead on the shore. Before returning to Greenland, she laid a brutal edict upon her crew. Anyone who spoke of what happened at the settlement would be killed. She used the profits from the voyage to buy their silence, and upon her return to Brattahlid, she told Leif a story of the Icelanders choosing to stay behind in Vinland. Leif, suspecting the truth but unable to prove it, could only curse his sister for her evil deeds. The Freydis episode is more than a tale of personal treachery. It is a metaphor for the corrosive nature of the Vinland dream. The promise of a new start, free from the constraints of the old world, had instead amplified the worst human instincts: greed, paranoia, and a ruthless will to power. The shores of Vinland did not create a new society. They became a stage for an old, familiar darkness to play out in isolation. With this final, sordid chapter, the Norse withdrew from North America. The regular voyages ceased. The stories told in Greenland and Iceland became layered with myth, warning, and a sense of a door closed. Vinland faded from a place on a map to a idea, a ghost in the North Atlantic memory. Yet, for one man, this collective retreat would become a personal crucible. He was not a saga hero, but a chieftain of the failing Greenland settlement, a man who looked west not for glory or wealth, but out of sheer, desperate necessity as his world began to die around him. His name has been lost to the official record, but his story is etched in the silent archaeology of the high Arctic and the logical extremes of history. He is the broken chieftain of our title, and his American nightmare was not one of violent conflict, but of a hope that turned to ashes in the relentless cold. To understand the chieftain's final, desperate voyage, one must first feel the creeping cold that was slowly strangling his world. The Greenland settlements, western and eastern, were never more than fragile outliers. Established during the medieval warm period, they depended on a delicate balance: pasture for cattle, seal hunting for protein, trade for iron and timber with Europe, and a climate mild enough to allow the growth of fodder grass. By the early 14th century, that balance was failing. The climate was shifting, ushering in the Little Ice Age. Summers grew shorter and wetter, winters longer and more vicious. The pack ice advanced southward, blocking the vital sea lanes to Iceland and Norway for longer periods each year. The Norse, stubbornly committed to their European identity, clung to a pastoral lifestyle that was becoming untenable. Their sheep and cattle overgrazed the fragile turf, exposing the soil to erosion. The sea ice made the migratory routes of seals unpredictable, and from the north, a new people moved in with superior technology and adaptability, the Thule ancestors of the Inuit. While the Norse shivered in their stone longhouses, burning precious wood to keep warm, the Thule thrived in the very same conditions. They built snow houses for winter, crafted efficient skin boats and toggling harpoons for hunting ringed seals and whales, and wore tailored sealskin clothing that provided far superior insulation to the Norse woolens. The two cultures existed in parallel for a time, but the Norse, bound by tradition and perhaps a sense of cultural superiority, largely failed to adopt these life-saving technologies. They viewed the Skrælings of Greenland with the same disdain they had in Vinland, as pagan outsiders, and this cultural barrier may have been their final, fatal mistake. As the 14th century wore on, the situation grew dire. The last ship from Norway arrived around 1000. 367. The settlements became isolated, their population declining from a peak of perhaps 2,000 to a few hundred souls scattered across failing farmsteads. Malnutrition left its mark on their bones. The skeletal remains from this period show stunted growth, signs of anemia, and severe wear. This was the world of our unnamed chieftain. He would have been a man of diminished standing, ruling over a shrinking community of hungry, cold people. The Great Hall, once filled with feasting and saga-telling, would now be a somber place, the conversations dominated by the dwindling hay stores, the missing seal herds, and the graves dug into the permafrost. The old stories of Vinland, told by the fire, would have undergone a subtle transformation. No longer tales of monstrous Skrælings and fratricidal strife, they would have become legends of a lost paradise, a land where grass was green, timber abundant, and the winters mild. In the face of existential collapse, myth often becomes a map, and so, a decision was likely made in that dim hall, a last throw of the dice for a chieftain with nothing left to lose. He would not go east, back to an Iceland that was itself suffering, or a Norway that had forgotten them. He would go west, back to the fabled, forested shores their ancestors had abandoned centuries before. He would find Vinland, not for plunder, but for survival. The voyage itself would have been an act of profound hardship and courage, a testament to the seafaring skills that persisted even as their society crumbled. They would have used a nar, the same sturdy cargo vessel that had carried the earlier expeditions, but this ship would have been patched and weathered. Its sail, perhaps a composite of older ones, the crew would not have been the robust adventurers of Leif's time, but a collection of starving farmers, frightened women, and children, not a raiding party, but a refugee fleet in a single boat. They would have followed the old route, west from the Greenland fjords, past the looming ice of the Davis Strait, sighting the stark mountains of Helluland, and coasting south along the treeless shore of Markland. Here, they would have stopped, desperate for the one resource Greenland could no longer provide, timber. They would have cut what they could, their axes biting into the spruce and pine, filling the hold with a cargo more valuable than silver. This act alone would have been a lifeline, proof the old stories were true. Emboldened, they would have pushed further south, seeking the specific bays and rivers described in the sagas, searching for the exact Vinland. But the world had changed in their 300-year absence. The climate, though still warmer than Greenland, was also cooling. The Thule people, whose technology had allowed them to dominate the Arctic, were also expanding and migrating. The shores that Leif Erikson found sparsely populated might now have been more firmly inhabited. The chieftain and his people were not arriving as explorers or even as determined colonists. They were arriving as starving, weakened supplicants, their very presence an obvious vulnerability. We can imagine their first, fateful contact. Perhaps they attempted to land at a promising inlet to repair their ship or gather water. They would have been seen immediately. To the eyes of the native inhabitants, whether Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, or another Algonquian people, these would have been strange apparitions. Pale, emaciated people in rough woolen clothing, speaking a guttural tongue, emerging from a large, clinker-built ship that itself was a marvel. The Norse, conditioned by generations of fear and the horrific tales from the sagas, would have seen every gesture as a threat. The chieftain, responsible for the last of his people, would have been gripped by a terror far deeper than any battlefield fear. This was not a fight for riches or glory, but for the literal continuation of his bloodline and culture. Any encounter would have been fraught with a tension born of mutual incomprehension and the long, dark legacy of the earlier violence. The chieftain's authority, derived from land ownership and animal herds back in Greenland, meant nothing here. His weapons, perhaps rusted and few, were a deterrent, but not a guarantee of safety for his vulnerable group. He was not Leif the Lucky, discovering a bounty. He was a lost and starving man, seeing his last hope guarded by those he had been taught to fear as monsters. The nature of the chieftain's breaking would not have been a single dramatic battle, but a slow, grinding realization under the immense pressure of absolute despair. Each day in that new yet cursed land would have peeled back another layer of his identity and hope. They may have managed to establish a temporary camp, a pathetic echo of Leifsbúðir, built with the precious Markland timber they carried. They would have tried to fish, to hunt, to gather, but every activity was performed under the spectre of unseen watchers. The forest, which from the ship promised shelter and resources, would have felt like a looming, malevolent entity. Every rustle, a potential Skræling, every distant sound, a threat. The chieftain's leadership would have been tested in ways no Greenlandic law code could address. How does one adjudicate a dispute over food when all are starving? How does one maintain morale when children cry from hunger and the future has shrunk to the next tide? The sagas speak of the Utilaga, the outlaw, cast out from society to live or die in the wilderness. The chieftain and his people had become a kind of collective outlaw, not from society, but from time itself, stranded between a dying past and an impossible future. The psychological toll would have been immense. The Norse cosmos was one of order, where fate was met with courage in the face of known foes. Here, there was no order, only a bewildering, silent hostility from the land and its people. His religion, a fading echo of the old gods now mixed with Christianity, would have offered little solace. The Christian gods seemed to have abandoned Greenland. Why would he protect them here? And the old gods like Thor and Freya were gods of the Norse world of the fjords, the thunder over familiar mountains, the fertility of known fields. Their power felt distant, irrelevant in this vast, incomprehensible woodland. Then would have come the encounter that shattered the fragile equilibrium. Perhaps it was a skirmish at a fishing weir, or an attempt by the native inhabitants to investigate or deter these strange, lingering visitors. It would not have been the large-scale battles described in Karlsefni's time. It would have been a brief, terrifying, and asymmetric event. Arrows shot from the tree line, striking one of the chieftain's few able-bodied men. A sudden whooping cry from multiple directions, a tactic designed to disorient and terrify. The Norse would have scrambled for their shields, forming a defensive ring, but they would have been protecting a camp full of the sick and the starving, not a company of warriors. They would have seen no enemy to fight, only fleeting shadows. In that moment, the chieftain would have understood the totality of his failure. His weapons were useless, his authority was meaningless, his very presence was a death sentence for those he was sworn to protect. The American nightmare was not just the threat of violence, it was the utter annihilation of context. He was a leader with nothing to lead, a provider with nothing to provide, a Norseman in a world that had no category for him except as a threat or a curiosity. This was the breaking. The decision to flee would have been born not of strategic retreat, but of sheer animal survival instinct. They would have loaded their wounded onto the ship, abandoning whatever meager shelters they had built, leaving behind tools or possessions in their haste. The voyage back north would have been a funeral procession. They were not returning to Greenland in defeat, they were returning to a known death because the unknown death in Vinland was too terrifying to contemplate. The chieftain, standing at the stern as the wooded shore receded, would have watched the land of his ancestors' dreams become the land of his personal and professional damnation. He had sought a green haven and found only a different shade of hell. The journey back across the Davis Strait would have been its own kind of purgatory, the ship now a coffin for their hopes. When the bleak, ice-scoured mountains of Greenland finally heaved into view, it was not a homecoming, but a confirmation of their doom. They returned to a settlement even quieter, even emptier than the one they had left. Perhaps they were the last group to ever attempt the voyage west. The chieftain's story would have dissolved into the general misery of the end times. There were no skalds left to compose a saga of his failure. His end, like that of the Greenland Norse themselves, is shrouded in the silent archaeology of the final years. A body in a shallow grave in the permafrost, showing signs of starvation. A last, small farmstead abandoned in midwinter. The bones of a starved dog by the door. A church where the final service was never concluded. The American nightmare did not end with a battle cry, but with a whimper, a slow fading into the cold. The chieftain was broken not by a superior warrior, but by the irreversible convergence of a changing world and an inflexible culture. He looked to the past for a solution, to the legends of Vinland, only to find that the past was a myth, and the future had no place for him. In a profound historical irony, the very people the Norse feared and despised in Vinland, the Skrælings, were the cousins of the Thule people who were then thriving in Greenland. Had the Norse been able to see past their own cultural blindness, had they been able to adapt and learn as the chieftains' ancestors had done when they first settled Iceland and Greenland from Norway, the story might have been different, but they could not. The chieftain's journey was the final, failed gesture of a society that had reached its ecological and cultural limits. His broken spirit symbolizes the fate of the entire Greenland venture, a bold, dramatic expansion that ended not with conquest or integration, but with a quiet, lonely disappearance, leaving behind only stone ruins, a few sagas, and a lesson in the brutal demands of a changing world. The silence that followed the extinction of the Norse Greenland colonies was so complete it lasted for centuries, a historical amnesia broken only by occasional, uncertain reports. When European exploration reignited in the late 15th and 16th centuries, the stories of the Norse in the New World had faded into the realm of semi-myth. The Vinland sagas were preserved in Icelandic manuscripts, but they were read as heroic legends, not as geographical guides. Men like John Cabot, sailing from Bristol in 1497, or Jacques Cartier, probing the Gulf of Street, Lawrence in the 1530 seconds, believed they were making first contact. They encountered the vibrant, complex societies of the Micmac, the Beothuk, the Stadaconans, and others, with no notion that other Europeans had stood on those shores half a millennium before. The legacy of that first contact, however, had perhaps subtly shaped the very interactions these new explorers experienced. While direct oral history of the Norse visits may not have persisted for 500 years, the possibility of a cultural memory of strange, violent, pale men in ocean-going vessels cannot be entirely dismissed. It may have influenced initial caution or curiosity. More concretely, the physical evidence of those visits lay waiting, but unseen. A Norse coin minted for King Olaf Kyrre of Norway around 1065 was found at the Native American site of Goddard Point in Maine, likely traded hand-to-hand over vast distances inland, a solitary whisper of contact. The stone foundations of what would later be identified as a Norse smithy and several dwellings lay buried under turf and trees at Lansor Meadows in Newfoundland, silently testifying to the reality of the sagas. But to the eyes of Cartier or any later fishermen who might have come ashore there, they were just strange, ancient mounds, the work of some unknown people. It was not until the 19th and 20th centuries that the historical and archaeological threads began to be pulled together, transforming the Norse venture from saga legend into historical fact. Scholars like the Icelandic patriot Carl Christian Raffin argued passionately for the identification of Vinland with New England, sparking both academic debate and romantic fascination. The true turning point came with the dogged work of a Norwegian explorer couple, Helge Ingstad, and his archaeologist wife Anne Stein Ingstad. Following a meticulous study of the sagas and the coastline, they arrived in 1960 at the remote fishing village of Lansor Meadows on the northern tip of Newfoundland. Guided by local resident George Decker to a group of overgrown ridges, they began to excavate. What they uncovered was unequivocal: the remains of 8 turf-walled structures, unmistakably Norse in design, identical to those found in Iceland and Greenland. The artifacts sealed the case: a bronze ring, headed pin of Norse design, a stone lamp, a spindle whirl for spinning wool domestic items, not lost treasure. Most tellingly, they found iron slag and a small stone anvil, evidence of ironworking, a technology utterly absent among the indigenous peoples of North America at that time. Lansor Meadows was not a large colony, but a base camp, a gateway for exploration and resource gathering, exactly as described in the sagas for Leifsbúðir. It was the first irrefutable proof that the Norse had reached the Americas. UNESCO would later declare it a World Heritage Site, a place of outstanding universal value as the earliest known European settlement in the New World. This discovery, however, did not simplify the story. It deepened its mystery and its tragedy. Lansor Meadows proved the voyages happened, but its small scale and short occupation also confirmed the ultimate failure. It became an archaeological snapshot of a moment frozen in time, a doorway that was opened and then deliberately closed. The story of the Norse in America is therefore not a prologue to later European colonization. It is a separate, closed loop of history. It stands as a poignant what-if, a road not taken. The Norse came, they saw, they struggled, and they withdrew. Their contact was too brief, too hostile, and too culturally rigid to result in any lasting exchange of ideas, crops, animals, or genes. They left no lasting linguistic imprint, no enduring cultural practice among native societies, no mixed-race population. In this, the experience stands in stark contrast to the later, world-altering Columbian exchange. The true legacy of the Norse in Vinland is not one of foundation, but of limitation. It is a case study in the harsh realities of transoceanic contact in an era before global empires, when societies were separated by more than just distance. It reveals the immense gulf that could exist between two human worlds, a gulf that could be crossed by a ship, but not bridged by understanding. The broken chieftain of our story thus becomes an emblem of this fundamental historical truth. His nightmare was born from the collision of a culture at its nadir with a world it could not comprehend or conquer. He sought a refuge in a legend and found only a mirror that reflected his own society's fragility. In the end, the land did not break him through sheer force, but by presenting a set of problems for which his entire cultural repertoire had no answer. The silence that swallowed his fate is the same silence that fell over the entire Norse experiment in the New World, a quiet, profound, and sobering testament to the fact that contact alone does not guarantee survival, let alone success. The shores of North America witnessed the Norse arrival, witnessed their fear, their violence, their ambition, and their despair, and then, for half a millennium, kept their secret until the patient work of archaeology finally allowed those silent ruins to tell their fragmentary, haunting tale. The story of the Norse in North America, bookended by the confident voyage of Leif Erikson and the broken retreat of the last Greenland chieftain, leaves us not with a clear moral, but with a deep and resonant historical echo. It is a narrative stripped of the inevitability that often colors our view of history, reminding us that events are contingent, that success is not foreordained, and that contact between civilizations is not a simple binary of conquest or integration. The Viking Age was, in many ways, defined by its astonishing capacity for adaptation, from raiders to traders, from pagans to Christians, from Norwegians to Icelanders and Greenlanders. Yet, in their final and most audacious geographic leap, that capacity for adaptation found its limit. In Vinland, they encountered a set of challenges, ecological, social, and psychological, that their cultural toolkit could not overcome. The resources they craved were there in abundance, but they were guarded not by armies they could defeat in open battle, but by a people and a landscape that operated by rules they could not decipher. The fear and violence that marked the contact, from Thorvald's initial massacre to the skirmishes of Karlsefni and the final, desperate vulnerability of the lost chieftain, created a feedback loop of hostility that made sustained settlement impossible. The Norse could build their turf houses, but they could not build a sustainable relationship with the land's original inhabitants, a failure that would be catastrophically repeated by later European arrivals under very different circumstances of power and disease. The enduring power of the Vinland story lies in its layered tragedies. There is the immediate human tragedy of individuals like Thorvald dying far from home, or the nameless chieftain watching his last hope dissolve. There is the cultural tragedy of the Greenland Norse, whose terminal decline made the Vinland dream a final, fatal obsession for some. And there is the broader, almost existential tragedy of a missed connection. For a brief moment, two hemispheres of the human story touched the European Iron Age and the North American Woodland period. They traded, they fought, they observed each other, but the thread was too thin, the context too fraught, and the moment passed without transforming the world. The profound isolation of the Americas from the Afro-Eurasian ecumene remained intact for another 5 centuries. When that isolation was finally and violently shattered by Columbus and those who followed, it happened with a different set of forces: centralized monarchies, the driving engine of capital, the devastating power of Old World pathogens, and a zeal for conversion that the pagan Norse wholly lacked. The Norse came in a longship, the Spanish and others came in carracks and galleons, backed by the apparatus of the state. The difference in outcome was not merely one of courage or skill, but of historical epoch and societal momentum. Today, Lanso Meadows sits as a quiet, windswept place. The reconstructed Norse buildings stand as respectful approximations, their sod roofs green against the grey sea. Visitors walk the paths between them, and the imagination strains to populate those structures with the figures from the sagas. Leif planning his explorations, Gudrid giving birth to Snorri, the first European child born in the Americas, according to the sagas, Thorvald nursing his fatal wound, Freydis plotting her treachery, but the most powerful presence is an absence. It is the absence of the Skrælings, the native people whose perspective is almost entirely missing from the Norse record, whose actions were reactive, defensive, and ultimately successful in compelling these strange intruders to leave. Their story is the other half of this first contact, and it is written not in sagas or stone foundations, but in their own enduring presence on the continent. The Norse came and went. The descendants of those who met them are still here. This final irony completes the picture. The American nightmare for the Norse was, for the native inhabitants, a successful defense of their homeland against a mysterious and aggressive foreign incursion. The chieftain was broken because he was, in the most fundamental sense, on the wrong side of a history he could not write. His journey remains a stark, poignant footnote to the age of Viking expansion, a reminder that not all doors opened lead to new rooms. Some lead only to walls, and the crushing realization that there is no way forward and no way back to what has already been lost.